Hi folks, thanks for visiting my YouTube channel. In this video we're going to talk about Net5's network improvement. Right, let's get the ball rolling. In this video we're going to see some improved networking features in Net5 which was recently released. So the first thing we're going to see is timeouts exception. So before Net5 what happens is the task or cancellation exception is raised when a timeout occurs and it logs. It's like a more generic exception. But after Net5, what we can do is we can do a type check to see if the exception is actually a timeout exception. In other words, we could actually filter the exception to see if it's timeout exception, and if it's timeout exception, and then we can actually take action accordingly. So before debugging, let's quickly see what the code does. So what we have here is we have an HTTP client which has got a timeout for 10 seconds. And it's going to call a local host which has got thread.sleep, which is for more than 10 seconds. So eventually it will throw a timeout error if it's more than 10 seconds. Then you catch them and you log them. But now it's a generic exception. It's a task cancellation exception. It's quite generic. So how could you actually apply this filter? So the best way to do is you could check for the inner exception, which is and check if it's actually a timeout exception. And that's it. That's all we need to do. So let's stick a breakpoint here, and now let's run the application. Right, so it's hit the breakpoint. So let's go through the code. So it's going to take more than 10 seconds. And it should return back shortly. There you go, it's come back shortly. So if you look at the no exception, it's actually an operation cancelled exception you've got here. But if you just dive into it, it should actually tell you it's a timeout exception. I think it's an exception level, you find it. There you go. So it tells you the timeout exception, and inner exception is cost due to the timeout it's cost due to the timeout. Right, so now if you actually go through it, it's going to log now. So potentially we can use a proper logging to do it, but currently I'm just using a normal log. The next thing I'm going to see is the status code. So in Net5 they've introduced a new method to ensure if the status code is 200. If it's not 200, it's going to just throw an exception. So and then what you can do is you could actually check the status code, and then you can act accordingly. In my case, I'm going to throw a 404 error, and then I'm going to check if the exception is 404, and then I'm going to just do the logging. So let me quickly run the application and see what happens here. So let's go through the code. Let's see what the response is. I'm able to get the response out. Oops. It's working. There you go. It's not found as the response. So now that should throw an error now. That's thrown exception. It's great. So now it's actually a not found exception, and then if you can't act accordingly. Yeah, so this is an extra method introduced in Net5 to check if the response is 200. The next feature we're going to see, we're going to talk about is the cross-platform handlers. So I believe it's before Core 2.1. Individual operating system had its own handlers, But after 2.1, .NET Core 2.1, Microsoft introduced more generic cross-platform handlers, but still they gave room to use the traditional handlers. But from Net 5, the traditional handlers are actually being removed completely, and they are actually using the cross-platform handlers. It's been very strictly implemented now. So for Windows, the traditional handler was used in operating system level was a Win HTTP handler. So when we actually do an HTTP call through the socket, it uses the Win HTTP handler to make the call. So for Mac and Linux, it was actually using curl handlers. And then from 2.1 onwards, Microsoft introduced a cross-platform handler called socket HTTP handlers. So as I explained, so when 2.1 was released, all three handlers were available, and then we can make a choice between which one you want to get, which one you want to use. But from Net 5 onwards, they've got rid of the first two handlers, Win HTTP handlers and curl handlers, and they're strictly using socket HTTP handlers for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So what does it mean? So when you do your HTTP call using HTTP client, under the hood is going to use a socket HTTP handler to make those calls. So let's quickly have a look. I've got .peak, and I've actually compiled or decompiled the DLL. So what I've done here is I've got so normally the namespace is system.net.http. That's where the whole HTTP client lives. So I've kind of decomiled using JetBrains.peak. And if you actually look for, let me expand this. I believe it's somewhere over here. You'll see, there you go. So they start using socket HTTP handlers, and you wouldn't find any traditional Windows or curl for Mac and Linux handlers anymore. You can't get them. You can get Windows handler through a NuGet package, but I think Microsoft are trying to get away from it. They want us to use socket handlers to keep it unique across platform. Last but not least, we're going to see how to define HTTP version when sending a request. So in Net 5, I think they've got a property called I think it's called default request version in HTTP client. So what this does is, let's F12 and see what it returns. It returns a version. If you F12 the version, you could see you can pass a version number as a string. You can also pass major and minors. We can pass major, minor, and builds. We can pass major, minor, build, and revisions. That's really good. So we can pass different types of versionings in your HTTP client. So all we need here is we're going to use a HTTP versions in our case. So let's do version, and if you I'm going to just do 2. So absolutely just put a comma on that. Right. So what this means here is I'm telling my HTTP clients to use a HTTPS version 2, so then I can take advantage of all the features available in HTTPS version 2. Right. So that is pretty much end of this video. There are many more improvements coming in Net 6, so we just need to hold on. I believe it's coming end of this year, so then we can have another short video on the new improvements coming in Net 6, especially in networking side. So meantime, please don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel, click the bell button, and once again, thanks for visiting my YouTube channel, and see you next video.